Yes, thank you for joining with me and anyone who's going to be watching this online, this little kind of video podcast that we're using. We've done a number of these, Pastor Dale, that just trying to equip, encourage, empower, all the good E words that you could hear for the district here in Canada Atlantic and beyond. So I appreciate having you, Pastor Dale, here with me. We were just sharing before we recorded that we did meet about 3 or 4 years ago. I think you were sharing very much the same thing we're going to be talking about here, which is mapping the future of the church with ministry action plans. You were a pastor at that time in New Life Community, and I don't want to have to share your whole bio, but you've had a number of experiences, and now you are blessed to serve in probably one of the warmest, nicest districts
it is
Florida.
A warm climate, brother. I last pastored in Oregon, and it got warm in the summers there, but generally cool most of the year, to zero humidity. And here you feel like you're swimming every single day. I'm a runner, and I just got back from a morning run. And I mean, you get out the door and you're already soaked. In Oregon, you'd have to go like 3 miles to feel that way.
Yeah, I'm originally from out west in Alberta too, so I think it's a little bit of a similar kind of weather out there than Oregon. But yeah, looking forward to going down your way, in fact, in NYC 2023. So
you're gonna make that trip?
I'm hoping to, yeah.
Hey, we're excited to host. Tampa is an awesome city. The whole Tampa Bay area, St. Petersburg, Tampa proper, growing out in Duluth, it's thriving. There's like 3 million people that live in the greater Bay Area. Oh, wow. Lots of new development happening. In a couple of churches over there. So there's some cool stuff. We're actually working with NYC to see if we can't find a way that NYC can partner, and we can partner with them to leave a church behind out of NYC. So that'd be kind of cool.
Wouldn't that be sweet? Yeah, you have quite the experience in church planting. That's a whole other conversation I'd love to have with you. But we're here talking about ministry action plans and helping churches kind of map out the future. And I would just love to hear from you and your experiences and kind of what's been revealed to you, what God's done with you and your ministry and your churches as you've gone through this process.
Well, I've really found ministry action planning to be one of the most important tools as a local church pastor. And I really didn't know what it was until I was in seminary. I went to Nazarene Theological Seminary, and my family started attending Northland Community Church. And that was like a new church plant up on the north side of Kansas City. And Larry McCain, he's the superintendent for the Chicago Central District right now. But Larry was the church planter there. And I think it was like the 6th he had planted. And we started going there. And I didn't even know you could start a church. I just kind of thought churches had always been in existence, right? It wasn't on my radar. And I was like, wow, this is cool. I mean, great culture, incredibly loving people. I was like, this is a kind of place that would relate to people who maybe had given up on God or given up on the church. They met in a cafeteria at a junior high school, had to sit up and tear down every week. And as I began to serve there, I became their NYI president. And Dr. McCain used a ministry action planning process every year with that church board. And so I had it modeled. And really that was an incredible gift. It wasn't something that I learned in seminary. No one showed me how to do that. That's kind of like the On Seminary podcast, right? That's out there. The things you don't learn in seminary, that was what Dr. McCain taught me, was a little bit of how do you ministry action plan. And it was pretty simple. It was kind of identifying the as is state of the church, what's happening in the church right now, what's going well, what's not going well. What gaps do we want to try to close in the year ahead? And then identifying 3, right? Like 1 to 3 goals that we could try to accomplish in the next year to close those gaps. So a gap might be, we don't have many first-time guests, right? We used to have a lot of first-time guests, and now we don't have any first-time guests. And so one of the goals might be to increase the number of first-time guests that we have to 5 new families or 5 new households every month, right? That would be our goal. And then you would put some sub goals underneath that. So what are we going to do every quarter to help make that happen? What are we going to do every month to help make that happen? And you might come away with a plan for outreach that you would call, we're going to do 4 big outreaches every year, like an Easter outreach, maybe a Christmas outreach, maybe a big summer outreach, and maybe a back to school or a fall kickoff. Here in the United States, those are kind of like rhythms that work pretty well. And then you might also say every month, we're going to have a big Sunday, whether that's like a baby dedication Sunday, or whether that's just an all church luncheon together and try to draw everyone that weekend, or a baptism weekend that would be a big draw on a monthly, so that you've got something to invite people to every single month during the year. And you would make that a goal, and equip people to invite might be a sub goal of that. So we're going to provide invite cards to everyone, and maybe we're going to do Facebook ads to promote each of those major outreaches to equip people to invite. And you kind of build that into your budget. So you say, well, what would it cost for us to go after that initiative this year? And you know that's going to cost some money. And so you build into your budget what those costs would be. And the idea would be that you've got no more than 2 or 3 goals like that, because you can't fix outreach the same year you fix discipleship, right? You know, that's just not going to happen. If you've got a gap in your student ministry system, you're probably not going to fix that the same year you're fixing outreach. That's a lot of goals to go after. Mm-hmm. So trying to be focused on what's the most important gap for us to close this year to make progress into the next 4 or 5 years as a church. Try to be a little bit longer sighted. And we would operate from a ministry action plan at Dr. McCain's church kind of every year. And so I had some tools that helped me in doing that. And then, kind of in a church plant, we adapted those and modified our process about when we do it. And I really began to build almost like a theology of why this matters over the last probably 10 years or so. So that's kind of the basics of how I got into ministry action planning.
Oh, that's cool. I like what you mentioned, like I've done this a few times, probably not to the greatest of success or as deep as you've gone, but just starting that process in my own church, and, you know, finding value in sitting down with the leaders of your church and saying, you know, where have we been? Where are we? And kind of where do we feel God's leading us to go? And then the thought of picking, you know, through that prayer, through that conversation and these processes, 2 or 3 goals, because it can be so easy to be, you know, to lay out all these things and recognize not just problems, but successes, and then kind of go too big rather than saying, no, let's find 2 or 3 things that we can really be intentional in, and then kind of have a step-by-step process to move us through. In fact, our church a couple of years ago, one of the very first times I used or tried to kind of have an action plan, one of the goals was be debt-free by 2020. And then like taking the steps, okay, you know, saying it's nice, standing behind a pulpit and going, we're going to do this. I mean, that we can all cheer for it, but then to have those feasible, like, all right, how's our budget going to look? What kind of fundraising things are we going to do? And, you know, where's something going to be tight and something we're going to let loose and things like that. So I found value in that. So,
yeah. And I don't think that happens naturally. You know, I think you have to be intentional about that. And just like you're saying, you know, setting the sub goal to support the overall goal. I think a lot of times in those planning meetings that we'll do with our leadership teams, we're good at setting the big goal, but then we never set the sub goals, right? The steps that get there. I'm a marathoner. I do running, and I'm doing a race this fall, right? I set that goal, but I have to have sub goals that are going to get me to that goal if I'm going to be trained up and not crash and burn. So I did a 3-mile run today. That's one step in a lot of steps that I have to take to get to running the marathon. And I think that these goals in ministry are a lot like that, right? You got to have the sub goals, the small steps to get you there. And you need to identify what they are and have a plan.
Yeah, I relate to that so much. I run and bike and do triathlons and stuff as well. So I get that need for the baby steps to get you to the bigger goals. So would you mind then sharing? I think. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I think you had a great idea. So go ahead there.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to recognize why this matters for a pastor, like the kind of the why behind it. I've got a talk that I do a lot of times with districts, and I prepped it just in case I had the ability to do a screen share with you this morning. I can make a screen share. Can you turn it on so I can screen share?
You should be able to do it. I gave you the power to do that.
Yep, I see it there.
Yep.
I'm going to do a screen share real quick because I think it might be helpful for us just to kind of think through why ministry action planning matters. It's not just a matter of making progress, right? It's not just a matter of me feeling good and helping the church make progress. It's actually a leadership responsibility for me as a pastor to help the church have this plan in place. I think of it like this a lot. I don't know if you remember, like when you got the keys to the car for the first time. I don't know, like, how old were you when you got your first set of keys, whether it was like a parent set of keys or a grandparent set of keys? How old were you think?
Oh, I don't know. I was a teenager, but I don't know the exact time, but
Around 15, something like
pretty
that.
empowering day. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an empowering day. It was a little bit of a frightening day.
That too. Yeah.
Yeah. I grew up on a farm, and I think the first set of keys I got at like 13 years old, and they were to like a farm pickup truck. Right. And I was excited and I was frightened. It came with all kinds of emotions. And I've got 3 daughters, and as a parent, handing off the keys of the car to your daughters is a whole nother level of frightening experience right there. And I think of that illustration for being handed the keys of leadership in the church as a pastor, right? Unless you started the church, someone was there before you, and they make a handoff, right? They hand the keys off to you. The church hands the keys to kind of help and navigate them. I mean, I believe in shared leadership, but you've got a leadership responsibility. And it's like, I'm not saying they're the parent, but when they hand those keys to a pastor, they're like a little bit nervous. They're like, okay, where is this guy or gal going to take us, right? Where are we going together?
Exactly.
And I think we should feel just a sense of like, it's about time, right? In our first assignment as a pastor, we may feel that. But I think we should have like a healthy fear that we don't want to mess this up. But I think more than that, I think we should feel responsible. I heard Andy Stanley talk one time about what leaders feel. And he says this, he says that leaders don't feel entitled, they feel responsible, right? And I think in our culture, we've seen some leaders, pastoral leaders, who have functioned out of more entitlement than responsibility. Like a sense that this platform is my platform and this is my church, in a sense of stewarding God's church. And I think you see this like in celebrity culture right now, especially in the church, where leaders are like figureheads and they're building their own platform, and they're not so much building the church, but it's kind of like they feel like they're building their church or their identity or their brand. And it's not entitlement, it's responsibility that we should feel. So I think there's some danger in celebrity church culture right now.
And I see that. In fact, I was just having a conversation with some younger leaders in my church, and was even kind of explaining that when you preach or you kind of lead the church, it's not a platform, it's a pulpit, and we're seeking God's direction and speaking God's word, not our own agendas and items like that. So
I think language matters. I think being careful even of calling things platforms, because then we think it's our platform, and it is a pulpit from which we proclaim the gospel. And we don't proclaim ourselves, but we proclaim Christ crucified, Paul says. And that's what we preach, not ourselves. And I think we have to be really careful about that. And so this process of ministry action planning, I think it helps you to be reminded this isn't your church, and I'm not trying to grow my platform, but we're trying to steward the responsibility. I mentioned Andy. He has another quote. He said this. He said, leadership is a stewardship. It's temporary and you're responsible. That's weighty. I mean, if you just sit in that for a second, leadership is a stewardship, not an entitlement. I didn't deserve to steward the churches that I've stewarded. I don't deserve to steward the Florida district that I get to steward. Someone was here before me and someone will be here after me. It's temporary. Every church I've pastored has been a temporary assignment. And I have to remember and center myself all the time that I have a responsibility to steward this temporary assignment as I possibly can, and not for my glory, but for God's glory, for the building up and maturing of the church in holiness. And I think ministry action planning is a key part of stewarding the church well. As the leaders, and we don't use it in our church culture, but biblically the word would be elders, right? The leadership team for the church, that we steward the church really, really well. So I think that's one of the reasons why this matters. I like this phrase. I heard Larry Osborne say this once in a mentoring thing I was in. He's, hey guys, listen, every pastor is an interim pastor. Someone was there before you, someone will be there after you. And even if you planted the church, you're interim, you will eventually have a successor and hand it off to someone else. And the keys get passed along. And ministry action planning really helps us to steward the responsibility as best we possibly can. I put it like this: our goal is to steward the church in such a way it sustains far beyond our season of stewardship. I think that's our goal. I got a verse that is kind of like a life verse for me in this. It's Acts 13:36. Is pressing, right? I think most pastors, their life verse is out of Matthew, right? You know, they want to hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I think that's good. That's a noble calling. But I was struck by this, I think in my late 20s, as I was studying Acts 13:36. And Paul said this, and Luke wrote it for us. He said, now when David is like in the middle of a sermon, he says, now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation. Notice it wasn't David's purpose. It was God's purpose. David served God's purpose for his life in his own generation. God has a time for us. He's got a specific time for us. It says that when he got done doing what God had for him to do, he fell asleep and he was buried by ancestors. And I love that this last part was included, and his body decayed. It's like, hey, he just got out of the way, right? He did his job and got out of the way. And his body decayed. I kind of want that to be like the testimony of my life. In my season, I did what God called me to do for God's glory, his purpose. And then I got out of the way and someone else did what they were supposed to do after me. So I think having some biblical foundations of our leadership responsibility is important. And it reminds us of the weight of this. It also reminds that the church hopefully doesn't have its best days in our days. That hopefully the church that we're pastoring actually has better days after we're there, and we want to set it up to have those really good days. Yeah. So those are like some biblical foundations for me. I'm curious, Andrew. I'd be curious in talking with you. How did you come to find that ministry action planning was an important thing for you as a pastor?
I think part of it when we started going through the ministry action plan was also, it was kind of taking kind of the onus off of me, or, you know, just like, oh, this is just something that Pastor Andrew wants, or this direction. And it was really laying it before the whole leadership. And it gave us this opportunity to prayerfully seek what God's plan was, as opposed to maybe my plan or the discipleship director's plan or the missions director. It was really finding this way of saying, like you had mentioned about, you know, it's God's future and it's God's plan. And then we want to, I used the word once of the legacy, like we want to continue to build off of what other people have built and make sure that there are more fruitful days ahead, and that we're being good, you know, workers to the harvest that God has given us. And as we went through that process, and like I've admitted to you that there's things that probably went better than others, and there was you know, some goals that maybe I had not noticed that others had noticed, and that became a really big thing that we were centering ourselves on. So for me, I saw great value in the collaboration and understanding that we are all stewards and we all have different positions in the church and in this harvest field and in this time, but we're doing this together. And one of the things that came from me, and as I even rewatched this with you, is just this idea that we're always, at least as pastors, kind of trying to work ourselves out of a job and empower the people around us, and make sure that the church has bigger and better days ahead after we've moved on. Like you said, someone who was here before us, somebody who's going to be here after us. So we want to make sure that we continue that trajectory forward. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I love that, because when I was in my undergraduate, I didn't learn a lot about team-based leadership. The model I was kind of taught was a little bit of the Maxwell model, which is a little bit like the Moses model, which is where the leader kind of goes away and they go on maybe a retreat alone, and they climb up the mountain, right? And they get the 10 commandments from God, and they come down and they say, "Thus saith the Lord," and, you know, the word of God for the people of God. And here's the vision of God for the people of God. And I am the man or woman of God, and I'm going to communicate it to you. And I was kind of taught that model. And in the local church, that some congregants expected that model. They'd kind of been trained in that model too. And as I studied the scriptures, particularly when I went to seminary, there was a heavy emphasis on team-based leadership. Mm-hmm. And my mind was kind of expanded to see that, oh, maybe all this weight doesn't rest with me. And maybe God calls leaders in the church, not just me, but leaders in the local church, to work together to discern God's preferred future for the church. And that was like an eye-opening, burden-lifting experience for me. Exactly what you're saying. I moved from what I'd call like a Moses model of leadership, where the pastor gets the vision and communicates it, to what I would call like a New Testament model, right? Based out of Ephesians. Paul writes to the church. Well, he writes to the churches in the region of Ephesus. He didn't write specifically to Ephesus, but it's a circular letter. It goes around to all the churches. And he writes like a book of theology, the first half of the book, and the second half is like the practice. It's almost like a church manual, right? Here's what we believe to be true. Now here's how we live in relationship and organize ourselves for mission. And in Ephesians 4, he says, now Christ gave some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be apostles, some to be teachers, some to be shepherds or pastors, so that the body of Christ would be built up. And you see in the New Testament, it's a plurality of leaders who discern God's purpose for the church and then build the church up in that purpose. And when I saw that for the first time, it was, it really was like a Damascus Road thing. The scales fell off and the burdens lifted. And I realized, oh, God put people around me and put me around people that together we might hear from the Spirit and help the church move forward. And I think a biblical foundation for team-based leadership is really important if we're going to put plans together well, right? So that's not the pastor sitting in their study and then writing the plans and asking the board amp the plans. I think that really matters. I a lot of times when I talk with church boards as a superintendent now, I'll tell people, we want everyone's input because you see what you see because you sit where you sit, right? In like when you're sitting in a boardroom together, there's some people whose backs are to different parts of the room, and the people that are sitting across from them can see behind them, but that person can't see behind them. And I think team-based leadership and understanding the current state of the church is like that. Mm-hmm. If you don't lead with a team, you have a lot of blind spots. There's stuff that you can't see, and you're never going to have the right perspective on it. And so by using a team-based approach to listening to what's happening in the church and sensing what God's saying, I think we get a lot fuller picture of what Christ wants his church to look like in a particular context. So I'm really dedicated to team-based leadership.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and one of the other points that just playing off of what you said there is also making sure that there's the alignment in the vision as well. Like, because I think there is still within the role of a pastor, I mean, there is that time of prayer and trying to spiritually direct the church and having the vision, but then it's also making sure that, everyone's on board with the same vision. So it's not just me and my desires, but I believe God would speak to all of us and being able to come together with something and then making sure that, it's all of our vision, not just mine, that then I'm trying to push across the board, which then pushes across to the congregation. And I read it once, I can't remember who it was, but I think it was Tom Rainer that had mentioned it, like that one of the biggest issues in churches and in planning things and kind of the misalignment in the vision is when the pastor and the church leadership or congregation are not together in vision.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Rainer has a great quote. He says that the number one cause, and this is research-based, so it's not just his opinion. He says the number one cause of pastoral transitions in the local church are a misalignment between the pastor and the church board.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm getting. Yep. Yeah. So it's making sure that there's that group vision. And it's much easier to grab onto a vision when you feel like you've been a part of discovering it, rather than just hearing from one person.
I think it's particularly critical. So there's the biblical basis for team-based leadership, right? And then you've got the pragmatic basis for team-based leadership. Oh, and I'm going to do a screen share on this one. This is good because we've got a biblical basis, we have a pragmatic basis, and then we actually have some bylaws that tell us that we need to do this. So I'd be failing in my responsibility as a superintendent if I didn't do a screen share on this particular one. So the manual actually tells us that we have to do this. So
I think I got that already earmarked for tonight. Right, I have a board meeting tonight.
Yeah, I always share it when I'm talking with people on this, because sometimes we don't realize that it's in our bylaws that we have to do this. Manual 122 just says this: every year the pastor and the church board shall conduct a planning session, to renew their expectations and goals of the pastor and the church. And then it needs to be written down. The written understanding of goals, plans, and objectives between the church and the pastor shall be updated. So you should have kind of like a continual ministry action plan that highlights your mission, your vision, your values. Will Mancini wrote a book called Church Unique a few years back. And he calls this kind of like the first page of the ministry action plan, the written understandings. He calls it a vision frame. It tells you your mission statement. It tells you your values, which is how you live in relationship, behavioral values. It includes your strategies that you've agreed to, right? So that might be weekend worship services, children's ministry, student ministry, missions outreach, right? And discipleship. Maybe those are your core strategies that you use as a church. And then it tells you your metrics, right? Your measures. How do we know that we're winning at these things? And that's like the first page of the ministry action plan. And so you've got that. It's always before you, right? Those goals, objective, or the mission, vision, values, strategy, and measures. Those should always be before you and be revisited every year. Is this still our mission? Are these still our value? Is this still our strategy, right? And you can update that every year in that retreat. And then you set some goals for the year ahead. What are the top 3 or 4 goals? And then some plans, those are the sub goals. And then you document that and update those plans every single year. And then this part here, you should file it with the district superintendent. So that's an important one. Most people don't do that. I did it when I was a pastor because I always wanted my superintendent to know what was up at church. I didn't want him to worry about what we were doing. So I think it's an important thing. And, the bylaws tell us we should do it. So it's a great practice. So we've got a biblical reason for doing this retreat and plan. We've got a pragmatic reason to maintain unity in the church. And then we have this kind of ecclesiastical imperative that we do it, right? Because our manual tells us we should do it. So, I mean, those are 3 pretty good reasons.
Pretty good. Yeah. And then we may get to this later, but I was just thinking as I was hearing you speak, one of the other benefits I found in having something like that, and I call it really like mapping the future, is that each board meeting, we tend to find a time where we actually bring it back out and we're going, okay, where are we at this? How are we doing? Because, it's easy to have these great retreats and leave empowered and we've got 3 goals, but then never look at that. Never look at that map again. So every month
you're telling me that you manage against the plan with your board throughout the year. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Fancier words. Yeah, you said it. But so we bring up the map every time and go, like, how are we doing with these things and these objectives and these goals? And
let me tell you, Andrew, you're next level, brother.
Appreciate that.
No, seriously, that's a best practice that far too many people don't engage in, right? They do the retreat, they create the plan, and then it goes on the shelf and they never manage against it. And in the practice you just described, I think is probably one of the most important parts in having a map actually move you forward. If you don't check in with the map regularly, it's very difficult to end up at the destination. But if you are every meeting revisiting that, you're going to be able to check and see the progress you're making and if you're off course or not and readjust. So I love that you're doing that and just would encourage anyone that happens to be watching this, like that's the way you do it right there.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot about the benefits of it. You've brought it from the biblical standpoint, the ecclesiology, all of that good stuff. But probably the question is then how do we do this? How do we create a map?
Right. Yeah, I that's a great question. Let me hit on maybe like some best practices then.
Okay.
And I've got that as a part of the presentation that I normally do. So I'll leave that up here. So let me just hit on a few best practices for conducting an annual retreat that then leads to a ministry action plan. Because I think the first best practice is that you have a retreat to do this work. Don't try to do it in one of your board meetings. It really needs more space than a 2-hour board meeting. You particularly, I think you need 6 to 8 hours together to have any kind of a developed map that really has buy-in to it. So I like to do this in a retreat setting. I like to do it over like a Friday night and a Saturday morning on a weekend. So I like to come in the evening on Friday night and share a meal together. And then I like to have a first couple sessions, and I'll walk through that in a minute here, but I like to have the first couple sessions that night and then come morning together and then share a meal again in the morning, like a light breakfast kind of continental thing. And then work into noon, sometimes 2:00, depending on how much work we have to do and what the agenda for that particular retreat is. But plan a retreat. And I like to say this, plan it 6 months in advance of the new year. So I think, Andrew, you told me before we started recording that you guys just came out of the end of your church year. Is that right?
Yeah. So May 1st was the beginning of our church year here.
Great. Yeah. What I like to do as a best practice is I like to midway through the year hold my retreat, because it helps me to build my budget for the year ahead. Now, you don't have to do it that way. I do believe that getting closer to the year end is dangerous because you won't have time to build the budget you need and put all the details into the plan and get it approved by the board. So like our church year here, it ends in February. And I tell our pastors, do your in September, October, no later than November. That way you've got plenty of time to put a budget together over the next couple of months that support the objectives that you create. So I like 6 months to form 4 to 6 months out from the end of the church year to be when to do that retreat. And part of the reason I like that is if you have new board members, right, that are coming on the board, I don't necessarily like that our first meeting is to put plans together, especially if they've never been a board member. I like them to have a little bit of experience, know the makeup of the board a little bit, understand the temperament of the other board members, so that personalities are better understood when we're doing that planning. So I think it helps us from that perspective too. So I like it 6 months out from the end of the church year. And then the second best practice I like is this. It's just hold it offsite if you can. Try not to do it at the church. I understand that budget-wise, sometimes you can't go offsite, but you can get creative. When we were in a church plant and we had a really small budget, I had a congregant who had a cabin out in the woods, right? Like a remote cabin, but it had, all kinds of bunks and all this stuff at it. And so we did our retreat at this cabin together and would hold it there for a couple of years. And that made it offsite. I like Mark Batterson. He says that a change of pace and a change of place leads to a change of perspective. And so if we don't retreat, that doesn't change the pace, right? If we just do it as a part of our normal pattern of meetings, there's no change in pace. And if we do it at the church, there's no change of place. And so we stay locked in our perspectives. But if we go offsite and we do it in a retreat in a setting that's not normative for us, then that change of pace, that change of place can lead to an increased change of perspective, which helps us to get fresh vision for the church. So I really like doing it offsite. When I was in Medford, there was a Christian retreat center that was about 30 minutes from the church, and they would rent us one of their big lodges that had cabins and all of that. And it was super cheap. I think our overall cost was like $400 or something for the cabins and the food and everything. That's what the retreat cost us every year. And we saw that as a good leadership development cost for the board. And honestly, if you're in a small church that doesn't have much of a budget and you got a board of 8 people, that's $50 a head. Your board might be willing to foot $50 a head to cover their own cost to the retreat. And that'd be another way to possibly get that cost covered from your board members. So I would say this, get creative but do everything you can to hold it off site. I think there's ways to do it. And then the third best practice is prepare your documents well in advance. So Andrew, I will email you the retreat planning tools that I have, which is like it's like the how-to guide on doing a ministry leadership retreat to create a map.
Awesome.
And then it also has some sample maps in it. And I'll email those to you so that if anyone wants them, they can get them. Okay.
Sounds good. I deeply appreciate that.
Yeah. And I'll try to get them in a Word document so that they're editable and not just PDF, because then they can take it and work with it and make it their own. But I'd say this: when you prepare your documents for the retreat, and you don't have the agenda I use, mine is a template, and I don't use the same agenda every year. I use different agendas, but I follow a similar pattern. There are some sessions that are always the same, some sessions change. I'll talk through that in a second. But prepare those documents in advance. What I mean by that is make sure your board members have the documents at least a week before the retreat. They need the agenda. They need to know what you're going to do in the sessions. If there are questions you're going to want them to answer, you want them to be prepared to answer those questions coming in, so that some people are really fast thinkers, right? And other people, they need time to digest and process questions. And if you just get into the meeting, they'll have a great idea, but it'll be 2 weeks after the meeting's done. And if you give them the documents in advance, they can be prepared to fully contribute to that meeting. So I like to have them done in advance and emailed out in advance. And then I like this: if you're in a setting where you typically just brainstorm everyone in a circle together and whiteboard things out, I want to suggest changing that up a little bit. Because if you do a large group brainstorm, if the group is more than 6 people, there will be people that lay out and don't communicate. They'll not speak out. So it tends to be your extroverts will speak out, right? Your processors and quick thinkers will speak out. Your Enneagram 3s, 7s, 2s, and 8s will speak, and everyone else will sit in silence, generally speaking. And if you get that group size too big, sociology kicks in and you don't get full contribution. So I like to do this. I like to break the groups up into small groups of 4 to 5 people in each group. And I like to give them a group captain, right? And have that captain facilitate a discussion around the questions at their table or with their group. And then have the group come back and present their answers to those questions. What that does is it gets full contribution from the full team. And it takes me out of the leadership seat for a session, right? Because you got a table host that's hosting those things. I may contribute, but I may just see myself as the pastor, as the facilitator for it sometimes. And that's a best practice, not just for retreat settings. That's a best practice for any brainstorming that you do. If the group size is larger than 10, break them into smaller groups of 4 to 6 people, and you'll get better results from your brainstorm than doing a large group brainstorm. And then the last thing I'd say is this: in a retreat setting, make sure that it's not all work, right? Make sure that it's not all just build a plan, build a plan, build a plan. It's not all business. So provide time for meals together, provide time for personal and private, provide time for corporate prayer, for some relational connection, maybe just some games together. And then do define reality. That's important. What's the current state of the church? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are the threats facing the church that we need to address? Provide some time for dreaming together, and then for deciding what you're going to go after together. But don't make it all business. Try to bring some spiritual formation to it, some relational connection. And I'll share more about why that matters in a second here. So those are just practices that I would encourage people to have around their minds as they're coming to this work. And then, I'd be glad to walk you through a retreat and in an action plan. But any questions or any comments on anything I've just talked about here that pop for you?
No, I think you're summarizing it pretty well. I do like the thought of, and I've can't say that I've been perfect at least on my side of things. The first one or two, we did do well with retreating and getting it out of the church, and, the change of pace, the change of locations, and then being intentional that this is the business that we are going to be going about. Sometimes when we try to kind of squeak it into a board meeting, well, there's reports have to be read and other ongoing things are happening, that all too often I found it kind of falls to the last thing we're doing. And then we don't have the energy anymore, and we're just kind of going with it. So it's really good to kind of prepare yourself of saying, we're going to this retreat, and the purpose of this retreat is to dream and to come together with and figure out where God's leading us and kind of create that plan. So the times we have kind of stepped aside and made that the intentional, I found it was a lot more productive than the other times where it was kind of trying to be pushed into a board meeting. And part of that was because of COVID, and we really didn't have that freedom to be able to escape and do that. But I am looking forward to the potential to try and kind of have a retreat or have that time forever, however long it is, to say, this is the goal that we are seeking, and everything else kind of has to be put aside for the moment, because this is what our mission is here, is to come out with a unified kind of understanding of how we're going to map our future. So
I think that's excellent. There's real value in getting away. And I will say this, there are times where, a pandemic hits or whatever, and you can't get away. And I've got some documents that I use that are like simple maps for emergency situations where you can't do a retreat and do a full map. And it's like just a 2-page thing that have like 3 questions, right? Like, what's not going well, and what are our goals for the year ahead? It's the most basic thing you could do. But I will say that kind of a goal or that kind of a plan is still better than no plan, right? Mm-hmm. Building, even having at least one board meeting a year be dedicated to this is better than not having any plan.
Yeah. Like, I know our most recent one, it was kind of very, very much what you said. Like, that's all we could do is kind of where we've been, where are we going? And in fact, our map ended up being the journey of grace. And we just were focusing, making sure that we were going to be intentional in each of the 3 stages, the saving, the sanctifying, and I'm missing the third one. But so that was our goal for the year, was just, and when we had, as I mentioned, those kind of sit downs every month and we reviewed our map, that's what we asked ourselves, what are we doing to share? What are we doing to make sure that we are saving? How are we encouraging sanctifying and things of that nature? So
yeah, I love that as a I think a lot of times we think in these metrics that are worship attendance or Sunday school attendance metrics or giving metrics, right? But formational metrics matter too. And if you notice that, so for example, in some of our churches here in the US, we have some theological alignment that needs to happen in churches, right? So maybe Christian nationalism might be seeping into a church or something like that. And there is a need for the proclamation of holiness in the life of that church. And if a board and a pastor are discerning, they can see this need among their people. And you might build into your map for a year intentional theological action around a particular issue that your congregation is dealing with, that you can't ignore. So for example, our district map this year had in it plans to increase the diversity of our leadership base in the church, because we're a very diverse district, but our leadership base is somewhat non-diverse, right? And so what are our intentional strategies that we're putting in place to increase the diversity among on the district? Because we have great leaders that are non-Anglo. We have great leaders that aren't males, but we're not seeing them rise to levels of leadership. And we've got to ask, what's the barrier to that, right? Mm-hmm. So these aren't like, how do we grow the worship attendance? How do we plant more churches? How do we get more people in groups, right? This is a very theological adjustment that needs to get made across the district that we're trying to address.
And you bring up a good point. I don't know if maybe I'm trying to recall if I did mention it earlier on and as we were talking, but part of going through this process and mapping also, I think, makes us face kind of the reality of honestly where we are and dealing with maybe some issues that we've seen is we kind of have to come to terms of maybe, like you said, there are gaps or there are things that we notice. You mentioned diversity, like getting real with ourselves. Here are these things that we're noticing that we should be correcting or we should be working to improve upon, or maybe there is a strength that we can get even stronger in. But I find each time we do sit down, it's kind of rubber meets the road. Where are we? And what's good? What is bad? And it's okay to have that conversation of where have we made a misstep, or where's something we've completely lost that we need to really put our focus on.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I like a part of the retreat being looking at outside the walls of the church. So we're not just like looking at our navels the whole time, right? Not just saying like what's working for us, what's not working for us, but in relation to how our church engages the community, what's happening around us, right? What are the events taking place around us? How's the community changing? How's the church changing? And is the church adapting to the realities of our changing culture, right? So if the community is becoming more and more diverse in its ethnicity, is our church becoming diverse to reflect the community? Or if it's not, why is there that gap between the community and what's happening in the church? So these retreats really give you the space you need to ask some of those more strategic questions around even what's happening outside the walls of the church in the community. Let me walk you through real quick, just a quick leadership retreat here. And I'll send this along, like I said, but I think it could be valuable. So let me just pull a copy of it up and kind of talk, when I talk about what do you do at a retreat to create your plan. Well, this will give you a pretty good example of that, I think. So this is the rough agenda that I use, but it has a few more tools in it than I would use in a standalone retreat because I use it as example. So let me just pull it up here. Can you see that?
Just a sec here. Yeah, I got it now. It just popped up.
Cool. So, this is a template I use in creating a leadership retreat agenda. I fix this page, which is the cover page, and I'd put my church name on it and make it look like it was personalized and all that. But it's just a template leadership retreat. And then I'll have an agenda in it that I'll walk through. And I remind them of the etiquette for the meeting. I think that matters because I don't know what culture's like in Canada exactly, but at least here, everyone's got their phone out and is texting all the time in the middle of a meeting, right? And so I just say, hey, turn your phone off in our main sessions. Like, let's not have our phones on. We can check our email between sessions. If you got a laptop out, use it for notes, but don't be checking email, checking scores, using social media and stuff. Value together. Let's be focused, speak concisely. Don't take more than a minute to say what you're going to say. Get focused on what you want to say and don't monopolize discussion. Let's have everyone talk. And I found that by clarifying those ground rules up front, it limits some of the sidebar conversations happening. It keeps people focused and on point. And if I don't use that, if I don't take time at the start of the meeting, they will do all the bad practices. So you really do need to clarify the practices for the meeting, right? What are the ground rules for it? And then just a rough agenda. So I like to, like I said, I like to start in the evening on a Friday with dinner, a devotional and prayer. And I like for someone other than me to bring the devotional and to lead the prayer time there. I like for it to be someone that I'm raising up as a leader in the church. So maybe someone that's a staff member at the church, a department director, someone that's got a call to ministry that I'm nurturing, local licensed minister, district licensed minister, church. But I really try for it to be someone other than me that leads that devotional time, both Friday night and Saturday morning. They hear me preach all the time. I lead the devotional and the board meeting a lot. So I like for it to be someone else. And now if it was my first year at a church, I wouldn't do that. I'd do it. Maybe even the second year, I'd do it. But by the third year in a church, I'm starting to delegate that out because they've heard from me enough that they know me. And And then I like to start out our evening session with just a celebration of what are the good things happening in the church, and then a reaffirmation of our mission, vision, and values. That's that vision frame I was talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
That guides the first page of the ministry action plan. I like to take that whole evening to kind of reaffirm, hey, is this still our mission? Are these still our values? Is this still our vision as a church? And I'll have it printed in advance so they can see it and review it and discuss it. And I have some questions to help us evaluate that too. And then Saturday morning, I like to start with breakfast and prayer, share some personal histories and strengths. So this is like a heart, I call this the heart session. Before we start dealing with the real business of the hard stuff, I want to break down, I want to humanize everyone in the room, right? If there's any division between board members, I want to break that down. If there's animosity between staff and board members, I want to do what I can to humanize them and help them to see each other and have compassion or empathy for each other. Because if people have empathetic connection that are working together, they are more productive as a team than they are if they don't have an empathetic connection. And it'd be great to think that everyone in your church leadership has an empathetic connection, but they don't necessarily. And so I want to be strategic in creating space for that to happen, and even for reconciliation to take place where it needs to. And I've seen this session lead to breakthrough in our leadership team where reconciliation needed to happen. So I'll share just a couple tools on that. And then the business, right? I might do some discussion on how does a church break size barriers. That's a really good discussion. I come back to that every couple years with a board. I might do a discussion on how do you lead change in the established church. So I would have them do some pre-reading of a book or an essay or a white paper, and then we would come together to talk about that in the session. Because whatever we're needing to address as a church, I want to do some learning around that leading into this retreat, so that while I am doing team-based leadership, I'm guiding where this team is headed, right? I'm trying to provide some boundaries on what we need to address. So this particular session was on breaking size barriers. And then I'll do a SWOT analysis or SWOT analysis, however you want to pronounce it, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then we'll get into the action planning. And this is where we determine what our top goals are for the year. So that's a rough agenda. Here's an overview, and it kind of breaks it down into each of the sessions, the celebration of mission and affirmation of mission. So I'll just put in there our mission statement, our vision statement, and our core values, and then some questions that I have us discuss. So is this still our mission, vision, and values? And, everyone will be like, yeah, that's still our mission, vision, and values. That's who we are. Okay, well, then let's dig into that a little bit. What values are beginning to be seen that we haven't documented? So are there values that are rising up in the church that we haven't documented, but they're behaviorally true of us? So we had one in a retreat that came up that was like sacrificial service. There were people that were just living incredibly sacrificially. And we were seeing this over and over again. And there was some, it was like Chick-fil-A language, second mile service that kept bubbling up all the time. We just go the second mile. We're a church that goes the second mile. And we had some discussion about, is going the second mile, is that becoming a value for us as a church? And we aren't going to change our values in 1 year, but we will do like a value study. And so out of that retreat, we said, let's watch this year and see if that continues to be a behavioral practice for us, or if it's just like something that came out of a training event that we did one time. And we began to watch that throughout the year, and the language did start to fade away. And so it really was just something it clicked with us for a season, but it wasn't really a core value to who we were. These core values remained. But for example, in another church I led, we had a value of excellence that had been a stated value for the church from the very start of the church. But our excellence value was butting heads with our reproduction value, right? We had such a value on excellence that we weren't releasing leaders. We were developing them, but they were never getting to the excellence level that we expected. And so we wouldn't release them to lead things. And we found in our retreat that these were in competition with each other. And finally, after 2 years of study, we released our excellence value to focus on the reproduction value. and the church began reproducing churches and leaders. That was a really important shift that we made that came out of a leadership retreat. For example, I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I think the Church of the Nazarene has an unstated value that should become a stated value. So we're Christian, we're holiness, and we're missional, right? Those are our three core values. I believe there's an unstated value of connectional, that we're a connectional church, that one of our unique strengths as a denomination is the fact that we collaborate with one another. We don't operate as independent and autonomous churches. And it is a unique strength. And until we articulate that as a unique strength and we make it part of a written core value, it will begin to fade memory of our church. And we will continue to slide into this more independent, autonomous perspective of the local church. And we won't live as a connectional, collaborative denomination or movement. And I'm concerned that unless we articulate that, we're going to lose it over the next few decades. And we already have been. The fact that we're having this conversation today, Andrew, is encouraging to me. It is a sign not of the missional nature of the church. It's a sign not of the Christian nature of the church. It's a sign, not of the holiness nature of the church. I think it's a part of that, but I would articulate it's a sign of the connectional nature of the Nazarene. And it's one of our unique strengths together. Okay, I just preached a little sermon, and I apologize for jumping on the soapbox.
That's great.
It's a great example, right, of why core values matter to a church and why stating those core values and leading against those core values matters to a church. So asking these questions is important. Should we adjust these in any way? What are the implications of these values for our mission? What are the implications for our vision? What are the implications of our values? What are any other values rising up? And we spend maybe 30, 45 minutes on that discussion on reaffirmation of mission, vision, values. And then we highlight successes from the past year. And I'll have some prepped already in documented form for them. And then we'll do some others. So like, what else are you seeing that are successes? And then 3 questions, and these are great questions to close the Friday evening session with. How has our congregation changed in the past year? What excites you about what we're doing as a church? What's unclear to you what we're doing as a church? How our congregation has changed is an important question because it shows you like the leading edge of where God may be taking the church, right? Pay attention to how the congregation has changed. What excites you about what we're doing? This shows you where your leadership team has alignment, right? What are you excited about? And then what's unclear to you about what we're doing? If you can learn what's unclear to your board, you'll then learn what's unclear to the congregation. Because if it's unclear to your board, I guarantee it's unclear to your congregation. And it's going to make you aware of some gaps that you might need to address.
I found when my church, the first time we kind of went through this and used this template actually, when we came to the value part, it was quite an interesting conversation because a lot of the hype words were coming out about who we are as a church and what our values were. And then the conversation kind of turned around of, are we really this? Like, are these really our values, or is this what we think we have to be, or we think we should be? Are they more goals than they are actually what we are? And that kind of really opened up quite the avenue of discussion of like, what do we truly value? Not what we think we do, not what we say, but what truly, when we look at our church, look at our people, look at what we're doing, what are we showing to be our values? And then if there are certain things that maybe we want to value or think we should, are those in fact goals that we should be, we really want to value and have, like you said, reproduction maybe as being a value we want, but we're not really doing it. So maybe we need to have a few years of working at that. And in time, that will become
that's good.
Culture and a value in our church.
Man, that is so important right there. Patrick Lencioni uses the language of actual values and aspirational values. Is the value that we have stated, is it aspirational in that we want to become that, or is it an actual value? And your documented values are exactly what you said. They should be the actual current values of the church. And then an aspirational value should not be listed as a value until you've put a goal to build that value into your church. And then you've actually embodied that value with behaviors that support the value. Now it has become an actual value that is truly a behavioral value of your church. Man, that is excellent right there. Have you read any Alencioni stuff, or are you just naturally smart, man?
Maybe I have. I don't know. Read a lot of books.
That's good. Well, that's what you were talking about. I was like, you get it. That's phenomenal right there. Hey, this is the heart session. So in the morning, I like to have a session where we get to the heart of things. And I just included some samples here of how to do this. One, and you wouldn't do all of these in a retreat. You do like one of these sessions, right? If you do them all, it'd take you all day. But one would be to have people share personal histories. I like to have them go around the room, answer questions. Where did you grow up? How many siblings did you have? Where did you fall in the birth order? And what was the most difficult and important challenge of your childhood? That last question, man, the dam will break on people's lives if they'll get authentic. And make sure you have someone that's really authentic and willing to share go first, right? So you go first usually, and then have the first couple people that share be very authentic people that you know will do well with it. I had my first retreat in Medford. My church board secretary and my worship leader had conflict with each other. They didn't respect each other. There was some animosity there. And we did this session, and they both shared their most difficult childhood experience. And they were both of them had heartbreaking childhood experiences. And they wept with each other. They prayed with each other out of that session. And that session that broke the dam in their relationship and built a bridge that united them in partnership and ministry together for the rest of their ministry together. Just this one session. And so I think this is so important. Don't ever skip over the heart session. Another one that's really good is to have people make a list of all the people in the room and then have them write down the thing you most appreciate or the most valuable thing they bring to our team for each person, and then go around the room and have everyone share with everyone affirmations. This is a really, really powerful exercise too. And then a last session I like to do, another one that I do sometimes, is I'll take those big sticky pads that you can write on and stick them around the room and give everyone a sheet, and have them on the top draw a picture of their 3 most important accomplishments or proudest moments this last year. And then on the bottom, represent 3 goals that they have next year. Or I'll have them write down their 3 biggest challenges they're facing right now and their 3 biggest goals for the year. And boy, when they go around and they get a minute to share that, and then you pray for them, that breaks down barriers too. Because what we're doing is we're humanizing people. That's a really important session.
For sure.
And then I just included a page on the breaking size barriers discussion. So a couple of tools I've used. Osborne's got a book called Sticky Church or Sticky Teams. Either one uses this, and he talks about size barriers in it, and how you have to restructure the church at each size barrier. And I'd have them read that chapter, and then we would discuss it in the session. And then Tim Keller has a white paper called Process Managing Church Growth. It's like a 20-page paper. I think it's the best leadership tool you can find for your church board to help them quickly wrap their heads around how different size churches function. And I use it with all new church board members, make them read it. And then we use it in retreat settings about every year. And we read the paper and we talk about how it applies to our setting and how our church could grow to the next church size based on what he talks about in the white paper. It really provides a lens through which we can set some goals to move us forward together. So I like to do that learning before we get into the state of the church stuff and the goal setting. And then lastly, and this is kind of the meat of the goal setting stuff, is I like to do a SWOT analysis, have groups answer these questions at their tables. And so I'll have them do strengths first, write down their answers, and then present. And then we'll do weaknesses, write down their answers and present. We'll do opportunities, write down their answers and present, and then threats, write down their answers and present. And this session takes anywhere from 2 to 2.5, 3 hours of the retreat. It's the biggest bulk of the second day. Mm-hmm. Because once you've done this, the goals for the year get pretty clear. The goals for the year get pretty clear. And then the last session is where we set the big goals for the year. And then out of the retreat, we'll work on sub goals. Like I'll have our staff work on our sub goals. Now, if your board is your staff, right, then you may need another session here where you work on some sub goals. And that could take some more time. Or you could use your board meetings to plan your sub goals for the next year over the next 4 months, right? If you're doing this mid-year, you can use the board meeting to do that more detail work. But the session to close that I like to use is a Patrick Lencioni session. This is from his book, Politics, Silos, and Turf Wars, is where this came from. It's a great book, and it's a great title for a book. Politics, Silos, and Turf Wars. How do you break down silos and create alignment in the church? And he says it's being these short-term kind of 6 to 12-month goals for the church. So I tell them the goal for the final session is to identify 2 to 3 high-level goals for the next year. And then I'll focus the question by saying, based on our church size reality, research on breaking barriers, and our discussion, right, about the strengths of the church, the opportunities, weaknesses that we're facing, what are the 2 to 3 things that we should do in the next year to take our next steps in accomplishing our mission? And then I'll have people individually answer these questions. Do not let them do this as a group, because the most dominant person will rule the day. I'll have them each answer this, and I'll filter the question some way to help us get to an answer. It might be, if we don't blank in the next year, we will have failed at following God's leadership to leverage our strengths against the needs of our community. Or, the number one thing we need to accomplish in the next year is X. But it can't be something that's always important. It has to be something that's important for this unique season in the life of our church to address the needs. If we do not blank, the church won't break the 800 barrier and be able to missionalize 1,200 people consistently. That's the barrier we were up against at the time. I'll have them write their answers down and give them time, 15 minutes to work on it. And then there's some questions here to help them filter their answers. Is this always important? If so, it probably isn't the right answer. When are we not focused on this? If it's something we're always focused on, then it's probably not the right answer. How is it different from every other year? Just to help them kind of focus what they have. And then we'll have them whiteboard out their answers. So we'll go around the room and I'll whiteboard out their answers. And what will happen almost every time is that 2 to 3 goals will rise to the top. Everyone will have very similar answers. And you'll have the outlier. Like I did this one time with a church board here, and there was the one person who said, we need to buy a bus and have a traveling choir that goes around to other churches. But she was the only person that thought that was what they should do the next year, right? And so immediately, I didn't have to tell her it was a bad idea. The board told her it was a bad idea. That's the beauty of this session, is people get to add meaning to the pool of shared meaning, but things that aren't the best idea are pretty quickly eliminated too. And almost every time, 2 or 3 of these come together, and you're able as the facilitator then to say, hey, it seems to me like these top 3 or 4 are our goals. How can we get this down to 4? And usually 1 or 2 of them are related to each other, or one of them is more important than the other. You can say, well, which one of these is the most important short-term goal for us to address? And maybe that other one is one that we push off another year. Or if we accomplish all these goals this year, we can bring it back around, but we really need to focus on these 2 or these 3 next year. And my goal is to walk away from that retreat with clarity on what the top goals are for the year. That's my bottom line goal. I don't want the sub goals nailed down. I'm going to work with my staff on that if I've got a multi-staff setting. If I don't, and it's a smaller church, I'm going to work with my church board on that over the course of our next couple of meetings. And I might come with ideas, right? I'll say, hey, here's some things I think we could do. What are some other things when we meet? But I'll start that work for them coming into the board meeting. So that's kind of a rough overview of a retreat. And then I've got a document that kind of highlights those sub goals and stuff that I can do.
That's neat. I'm trying to see if I've got one that I'm trying to show here.
Cool.
I might have to do my own screen sharing here, but
Okay.
What came out of that, because often we have these things and we have great people like you come and talk about these ideas, and then they say, like, I mean, the idea is great, but what's it look like for us? So I'm just seeing if I can do this here.
That'd be
Taking
awesome.
what you did and doing that plan and some of the information you have, I think I'm safe to share this, but see if I can share. This was from, like I said, the COVID one were a little bit different, but can you see that?
I can. Yeah, that's
So
great.
this was kind of like us taking pretty much what you had shared and came out with this. As you can see, this was a draft, so it hadn't been quite finished, but kind of going through what was shared there. So like, what's our mission here, our core values, kind of an overarching where we were going to, put a strategy, but then there were we had 4 goals that year. So that's kind of the page we left with after going through our retreat. And then later on, we kind of then ended up doing a lot more of the detail kind of
That's
breakdown.
great.
And then here's our action steps. What are we going to do to get, to there? So
Hey, leave that up for a second. So leave this up and just kind of like lock it down on that debt-free one for a second here. So what you did is you set your big goals, and then you got the sub action steps that support those goals.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but this was and it was an ongoing thing that at this time it wasn't finalized, but that's what we were going through. So, here are some of the steps that we were going to do to make sure that we would see these things achieved or at least strengthened.
Yeah. That's great. So and I like that in addressing the debt, you've got, a multifaceted strategy, right? You're not just counting on one thing to address that gap, but you're trying to find multiple ways to set. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So anyways, for anyone that's watching this and goes, this is all fine and dandy, but it for an 800 size church or a 200 size church, my church at that time, I mean, where were we? Our attendance was about 78 at that time. So, I mean, taking what we have and scaling it to where we were and to what our mission was and what God had for us. And this is where we were talking about our core values. And there was a number of other ones we had that we were going, love to be this, but are we there yet? Or is this what we want? And those were the few that we came down with that were truly values that the board at that time had found in our church. And I think strategy was the only thing that we might have added. And a lot of that was more out of sermon series and things like this. What are, kind of, if people share, how are we doing things, you could almost summarize it really quickly in those ways. So.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a help. And it encourages me to see how someone's taken stuff that I've been working with for years and is implementing it locally, because I have seen consistently that churches that will do this see progress. And now in my role as a superintendent, I really see it. Churches that operate on a ministry action plan and to be the churches that are making consistent progress, and churches that don't operate from a ministry action plan tend to be churches that find themselves struggling in accomplishing their mission. And it's not the churches that pray the most and the churches that don't pray at all. I mean, I wish I could say that's what it was, right? And I think prayer matters. Please don't hear me say that prayer doesn't matter. But I will say, when I work with the church, if they don't have a ministry action plan, very few of those churches are taking new territory for the kingdom.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And like, I know we focused on the one, like you said, freeze it on the debt one there. And I mean, that was from a few years ago, but even in the midst of COVID, and I believe the ministry action plan helped it. And that truly was one of the goals we had, even in the midst of COVID. And it is truly God at work too, but we saw it done. Like it was achievable and it happened. And I think a big step of that was putting something like that to paper and saying, we're not just going to dream it and say it, but we're going to plan for it. And it helped. So.
Well, praise God. And please don't hear me make light of prayer. I
don't think so.
We had a whole year. I saw it was on your list and it was on my list for a year, where we wanted to raise the spiritual temperature of the church. And so prayer became a major initiative. And out of that, the church began a process that it holds on to today of doing 2 month-long prayer and fasting seasons every single year.
Oh, cool.
and equipping people with daily prayer tools for their spiritual practices. So, it really does matter. And I think it's an important thing, but I'll say having a plan to help your people pray might be helpful.
That's good too. And no, I don't think you're diminishing prayer in any way. In fact, I've said it in boards, I've said it in sermons too, that, we got to get beyond the praying and then kind of sitting in our Barca lounges waiting for it to happen. I think when we pray, we have to then go out and get it. Just like people in Exodus, right? When the manna was there and everything, they didn't just sit there and it showed up in their pots. I mean, God provided, God blessed, but they had to go get it. So we often ask ourselves, as we pray these things, how are we then now going to trust in God and take the steps to see those prayers answered? And maybe how are we the answer to those prayers? So it's
that'll preach right there.
It's the lattice work, right? Prayer is the lattice work of everything that we do, but then we got to build off of that prayer. So,
and that's good. Cool. Man, this has been a great conversation today, Andrew. I'm really glad that you reached out to me and invited me to be a part of it.
Yeah, I've deeply appreciated it. Like I said, it's been a few years that this has been in my head, and I'm like, man, I just really wish others had been able to know about this. So I thank you for taking your time. I know you're busy down there surfing or whatever else you do in Florida, but I thank you for
board meetings, man. Lots of board meetings.
Lots of board meetings.
Meetings.
No, I appreciate that. And if you could share any resources that I could share with the rest of those who are watching or those on my district, that would also be welcomed and appreciated. Would you be open to?
Well, let's make an exchange, brother. I'll do this. I'll send you some resources. You send me the link to this when it's done, and I'll share it with my pastors too. How about that?
All right, sounds good. That's the deal.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and I hope it proves beneficial to many churches on my district and beyond.
Yeah. All right, man. Blessings on you.
You as well. Just